Okay. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the seminar this week. This week we have a special guest to me, especially. This is my old master's advisor, Dr. Kyle Strom from Virginia Tech. Deals in pretty much everything sediment transport, environmental fluid mechanics. And he's actually the reason that I know Chen Young, who is now my advisor here at CSU. So taking it all full circle this week. But yeah, so he's going to talk about mud and everything that's great about mud today. So let's give him a warm welcome.
Yeah, all right. Thank you. Thank you, Sam. And thank you, Chen Young, for inviting me. It's great to be here. I've always wanted to come to Colorado State University. So I've been hearing about the lab and all of the historic sediment transport work that's been done here since I was started my graduate studies as a master's student at Washington State University. So the title of the talk is Mud Transport in Rivers. And it was originally lab and field observations, but I've scratched the lab part because the talk is already too long just talking about the field component. So we're just going to talk about some field observations. So what we'll do is we'll talk about mud and what it is and what makes it unique. And then I'll kind of share some findings from a few different studies on muds, but really looking at mud in rivers. Okay, and I should acknowledge my co-authors here. These are students who have worked with me, who have worked on aspects of this. So Hassan was a PhD student. Ryan, Braden, Laylee, and Christian are all master's students. And then I'll show you one of the components of the field work was done in collaboration with Jeff Nitrauer from Texas Tech University and Karen Dunn, who's now at TU Delft. All right, so sediment, right? In rivers, we have a big range of particle sizes in rivers. Right, think of a mountain stream. Boulders come down off the hill slopes and they're in the river and they're quite large, maybe never even mobile, but we have these really big particles on the order of meters. Right, and then we have sand-sized sediment, and then we have mud. Okay, so mud is going to be, I'm going to just say that mud is all the stuff, both mineral and organic, that is less than 63 microns, and we maybe even bump this up to everything less than about 100 microns or so. And the big difference really between these is like here we have really big particles and big range of sizes, and down here, but we have a smaller range of sizes, but the particles are so small that their individual gravitational force is not the deciding factor in the transport dynamics of these small particles. So here, gravels and sand, right? Like the characteristic, let's say, velocity scale for a particle is the square root of g times d times the submerged specific gravity, right? It's the sediment size and density really dictate a lot of the gravitational forces, the frictional forces that we have. But with mud, what happens is that the particles are really small. Gravity's still acting on them, but there are many other forces. And we're just going to lump those all together and say that they are cohesive forces that cause the particles to stick together. And then for them to have forces that especially from the perspective of resisting motion or resisting being broken apart, that are far greater than what they would be if we just looked at the weight of the particle itself. Okay, so we have mud all through our fluvial system, our estuarine systems, out in the coast. So we've been looking at mud sort of in all of these different contexts. So upland streams, large rivers, estuaries, and coastal areas, and even out thinking about mud movement on the bottom of the ocean floor and how these big contorite drifts build up, and what we can learn if we go core them and look at the changes in the grain sizes moving up through those cores. But mud here, like, so let's just focus on this area here. Like, this is the Mississippi River Delta. I hope you can see that there. One of the things that I was really surprised about when I got into studying mud is just how much of it there is coming out to many of our coastal areas. Like the big coastal rivers, like the Mississippi River, like 70 to 90% of the total mass that's delivered to the end of the system here is mud, right? So we're talking about something that makes up a major portion of the total mass in a river. Now, this may not be the case for a Colorado mountain stream. We may not have that much mud. In fact, I guarantee you don't have that much mud. But in some coastal areas, it makes up a really big fraction of the total mass of sediment that's delivered. And because of all these cohesive forces, there are some really interesting things that happen with mud. So if you go in and you take a microscope image of sediment that's suspended in the water column out here, what you see is that it looks like these particles are muddy snowflakes. So it turns out that mud exists almost always in some kind of aggregate form. So here's a scale. This is a millimeter. And so these particles are something, I don't know, maybe 10 microns up to 150, maybe 200 microns in different places. But they're very irregular. They're not solid, and they're made up of groupings of particles or these clusters of particles that we call flocs. So this is one of the really interesting things about cohesive sediment, is that within the water column, particles don't exist. Like if you looked at clay sizes, we'd say clay starts at 4 microns. There's very few particles in the water column, even if they're made up of clay mineral, that exist at that small size. They usually exist as part of some larger aggregate that could have both organic material and mineral material, could have clay minerals and clay size sediments, silts. They're all clumped together in these muddy snowflakes that we call flocs. And one of the things that's very interesting about these is that they change their size and they change their density. So flocs can grow in size, they can shrink in size, depending on the turbulence levels, depending on the concentration, depending on the types of sediment and the types of organic material, the water chemistry. These things grow and shrink in size. Now, from a sediment transport perspective, these particles, like one of our key aspects, if we wanted to model this suspension of mud, would be we want to know what the settling velocity is, right? And for a settling velocity of a grain of sand, there's variability with it, but if we know the size, we can make a good estimate of the settling velocity. We can do the same thing for a mud floc, though it's a little harder because it's not a solid particle. But the settling velocity is still going to be a function of the size, and it's going to be a function of the submerged specific gravity of that particle. The tricky part is that these things grow and shrink in size depending on the conditions that are there in the water column. So if I took a sample and I ran it through a particle size analyzer, I would get a different size distribution out than I would if I could measure these particles in situ. And they're constantly changing size. So this makes getting at the settling velocity of mud tricky, because what's dictating the settling velocity is the size of these muddy snowflakes or flocs, and they change depending on the environmental conditions. Okay. Most of the people who have considered the transport of mud and flocs, they're working in coastal areas. So these are just some videos from last week. We were in the Delaware River estuary making measurements out there. And we have a microscope camera that I'll talk more about, but we can image the particles that are in the water column. And it's all flocculated. All of the suspended material is flocculated. And historically, we've known that the muddy material in coastal areas is flocculated. One of the thoughts has been, there have been other competing lines of reason, but sort of the primary thought has been that the reason we have these mud flocs in coastal areas is that there's salt present in marine water, and the salt shrinks the thickness of the double layer around these small particles so that they can get close enough and they can stick together and form these flocs. And so the idea is that in freshwater systems, you have unflocculated fine material, and in saltwater systems, you have flocculated mud. But one of the things that we've found out, and we'll talk more about this, and others have come to this at different points in time through different angles, but we have found that pretty much any time we've put a camera in the water to measure the size of the suspended material. The muddy fraction is almost always flocculated. So we haven't made measurements out here in the mountain west or the west, but pretty much anywhere else we've measured it in the East Coast, we've measured in Brazil and some Amazon tributaries. The mud has existed in a flocculated state. So this is true for like the freshwater portions of the Mississippi River. It's true in like little headwater creeks around Blacksburg, Virginia, in the Appalachian Mountains. It's all flocculated. And so that's pretty interesting because it means that the mud is when it's in a flock like this, what it means is that the mud is going to have a higher settling velocity than it would have if it was in a disaggregated state. It was just a bunch of little tiny particles in the clay size range. And when you went to calculate a settling velocity from Stokes' law or something like that, you would get a very slow settling velocity. But the mud has a much higher settling velocity than what you would get if you calculate that settling velocity using Stokes. Okay, so what we're going to talk about is mud and fresh water. That was a big lead up to say we're going to talk about mud and fresh water. Our group has done a lot to look at mud and salt water and understanding how changes in salinity and organic composition change flock dynamics and settling velocities. What we're going to focus on today for this talk is mud and fresh water. And so you might say, like, why do we care about mud and fresh water? Why do we care about this? So the number one reason I care is just like it's there. We have mud in our streams and we don't have good tools as engineers and scientists to predict the movement of mud in freshwater systems, especially freshwater systems where we have sands or gravels also in the bed. Okay, so we're going to focus more on looking at muds in these sorts of systems. And this could be important, one, because it's there and we don't know what it is and we want to learn something about it, but it's also like we have fine sediment that gets into our stream. So you think about like gravel bed streams, and you have a big wildfire, right? There is wildfires here. You might have some more this summer, but like 2020 was the big year, I think, right? Where there's big wildfires, a lot of fine sediment gets into the river. Some of that is like sands but then there's probably some finer fractions too. Or the thing that really got me thinking about fines and gravel bed rivers was several years ago, there was a mine tailing spill. And I remember seeing this beautiful cobble bed mountain river, like before the mine tailing pond broke and all the fines got into the system. And then after, and the fines afterwards, the fines were all definitely in the gravel bed river. Or if you think about flushing fine sediment out of a reservoir and it goes into a gravel bed stream down, gravel bed reach downstream of that, like what happens to it? So we just want to be able to predict and understand what happens to fine sediment as it moves through the fluvial system, not just at the coastal areas. But then these fine sediments are also pathways for contaminants, like mercury stays attached to fine muddy sediments, phosphorus does as well. And in Appalachia, one of the major contaminants of our streams, our gravel bed streams, is having fine sediment in the river. Okay, so it's all over the place. And then some of the motivation for other things we're talking about is like, especially on the Mississippi, is land building. Like the Mississippi River has 70 to 90% of it is mud. And if we're like thinking about how does land build off of natural or man-made diversion structures or breaches and levees, understanding where if we put a hole in the levee, we need to know what the flocculation state is before the water gets in here to understand how far that sediment's going to go out before it travels and deposits. Okay, so I think there's a bunch of reasons why we might care about flocs in fresh water. All right, so this is the first part of the talk. Second part of the talk is where we're going to talk about mud in the water column, and here's where we're going to focus on the Mississippi River. First of all, I want to talk about how we measure the mud in the water column, and then we're just going to look at the flocculation state of the Mississippi River. We'll talk a little bit about implications for modeling, but the big idea here is like, is the mud in the Mississippi River flocculated? And if so, what dictates how big those flocks are, because that is going to change the settling velocity of the mud. And that has implications for deposition. And then the next part of the talk, we'll look at mud exchange with a bed, and the context will primarily be gravel beds. So we have a gravel bed, and then we have a muddy suspension flowing over it. We might have mud in the bed, and we'll look at exchange there. Okay, so let's look at flocks in the freshwater reaches of the Mississippi River. I mentioned that it's a big motivation here is thinking about what happens to the mud if it was to go through a natural or man-made diversion. My guess is many of you know that Louisiana is losing a lot of its coastal land. It's losing it at a very fast rate. Some of that is because of natural subsidence, some of it's because of pumping, some of it's because of sea level rise, and some of it is because the Mississippi River has levees running all along lower Louisiana. And where in the past, the Mississippi River would be free to move around, and when the water got up above its banks, it would distribute sediment that's in suspension out into embayments and areas of lower velocity, and it would deposit and help to build land. So like all of Louisiana is built by the Mississippi River depositing sediment at its terminal end and avulsing and moving back and forth over time. And now what we have is the Mississippi River is fixed in a position, and the flood water doesn't make its way out into the embayments anymore, and it's leveed, dredged all the way out here to like Southwest Pass and South Pass. And out here we're starting to get out into deeper water on the shelf, rather than depositing in this shallower area where we would have there's less accommodation, so you could build land faster. So the question is like, what is the flocculation state of the Mississippi River? And then other questions might be, how might they change? The flocks change in size as they go through diversion structures. So the first one, and the one we're going to look at today, is just what is the flocculation state of the Mississippi River? And we're going to focus down around New Orleans. So this is the Mississippi River basin. I'm going to show you pictures from down here at Venice, Louisiana, and right around New Orleans. We've also have some measurements up here in Illinois in the Mississippi River. And then this is Virginia Tech, is right at the part of the headwaters of the Mississippi over here in the Appalachian Mountains. We'll show you some pictures from there. Okay, so here's the study site. This is the lower Mississippi River. There are two key locations that I want to show you. Maybe I can use this. Yeah, can you see that? Can I shift this to be a pointer? That would be helpful. All right, so here's New Orleans, and right here is the Bonnie Carey Spillway. And if you're a hydraulic engineer, you should know about the Bonnie Carey Spillway. But this is a region that we're going to reference, the Bonnie Carey Spillway just upstream of New Orleans. Here's New Orleans, Mississippi River flows down here. There are some natural diversions or gaps where water and sediment is flowing out. So the river is sort of losing steam as it flows basinward of New Orleans. And it's going to come out here and it's going to break out into different channels and distributary channels down here. So this is head of passes. And then there is a place right here called Venice. And there's a place called Venice. We call it Venice Main Channel. So we're going to be comparing the flocculated material or the material in suspension. One of them is up here at the Bonnie Carey Spillway. Here we have the river is pretty energetic, like 1 to 2 meter velocities, deep, like 20 meters deep, big dunes. You can see like sand being ejected up into suspension all the way up in the water column here. And then down here in Venice, you have it's not quiescent, but it's less energetic. Okay, and you start to get some deposition of mud within the channel down in here. Okay, so these are two areas that we'll talk about. We also made measurements all through these passes, but I'm not going to discuss that today. Okay, so the sorts of measurements we were making, right? We're just trying to ask the question, is the material in the Mississippi flocculated? I also was curious about if there's any spatial distributions of flock sizes, either in the vertical or lateral direction, and did we see any seasonal variation? So we're going to focus on the freshwater surveys. We have two surveys that we're going to compare. One is in the summertime and one is in the winter. And there's a roughly 20 C change in the water temperature. The discharge was about the same for both of these winter and summertime sampling. And the overall suspended sediment concentration was about the same. And I don't put it here, but like the dissolved organic carbon was about the same. So we made measurements off of a little survey boat. And we're going to talk about the camera system that we use to measure the size of the flocs. And then we did kind of other standard measurements, ADCP, point samplers with a P6 and bed samples and the like. Okay. So making measurements, one of the reasons that we didn't know so much, we have not as much information about the flocculation state of freshwater systems is that it's really hard to measure these fine particles. You need to measure them in situ. And because they're irregular in shape, they don't behave very well with light. So a typical like in situ laser particle size analyzer can do a pretty good job of sizing silts and sands, but it struggles to size these small particles. And acoustic devices also struggle. So the best way to get measurements of the size of these flocs, these mud snowflakes, is to take microscope pictures in the water column. But what we want to do is take microscope images in the water column while the water is turbulent and swirling around. We don't want to sample it and take it somewhere else because the flocs change. And so what we did was we had developed some good techniques for measuring these in the lab, and we made a field version of that camera. So we have a microscope objective here on a digital camera. We have an LED light source, and we control the camera position and the settings and the light through Ethernet cables that run up to the boat. And so we can drop this camera and we can profile, we can capture a bunch of images. And then we take all of these images and we run them through image processing routines that we've developed to classify the particles into these mud aggregates and into solid silica particles, to break those two distributions apart and then to measure them. And we can also extract a concentration proxy with that. Okay, so we can make a bunch of measurements and we can get profiles of floc size, which is one of the things that we need to know if we want to know how fast this stuff settles. So for us, really, like we dropped this camera in, and when we dropped it in the Mississippi, we didn't know what we would find. And then we were hoping there would be flocs, but we had no idea. And the cool thing was, like, every time we put this in, no matter where we put it in, all the material was flocculated. And it was flocculated well upstream of any saltwater intrusion. So we ran it through the salt wedge and out into the Gulf, and certainly it's flocculated there as well. But really, there were very, very big, well-developed flocs far, far upstream of any saltwater intrusion. Okay, so Bonacary Spillway is the more energetic region upstream of New Orleans, and then the BMC, the Venice Main Channel. This is, it's upstream of Head of Passes, but downstream of New Orleans. So in all of these cases, we have flocculated material. Bonacary Spillway, oftentimes we would get, this is like very fine sand here in suspension as well. And we did it in winter and summer. In all cases, we had flocculated material. So that was just one of the things we wanted to know is the mud in the Mississippi River before it gets to the saltwater flocculated or not? And the answer was, yeah, it was flocculated. The other thing you can see just from these images is that even though the mass concentration between the summer and winter were about the same, so between 100 and 200 milligrams per liter on average, there's a difference in the size distribution between these two particles. At the same location, roughly the same discharge, we have different sizes of these flocs. The other thing you would notice, especially in the summer one, is that you tend to have larger flocs down here in this Venice Main Channel. Okay, so that was the very first time we developed this camera. We took it out there and we were making measurements in the lower Mississippi. And then we just started saying, well, hey, let's just drop the camera in other locations and see what happens too. And so we like the student who worked on this was from Illinois, so he took the camera home with him and he dropped it off at the place where he always puts his boat in to go in the Mississippi. Oh, there's big flocs there in the Mississippi, way up in Illinois. And then we were like, got home to Virginia and we stuck it in our local creeks. And then we're like, oh yeah, that's all the mud there is flocculated too. So in this Mississippi River Basin, so far we haven't found a place where the material is existing as the just really fine individual particles. There are locations where it's more or less flocculated, or we could say there are some cases where it's more just these small particles and fewer of these big particles, but there always seems to exist in this aggregate form. Another interesting thing that we found, we're just looking through images, is that we often had solid silica particles bound up in the clay organic flocs as well. So these flocs are not just clay. They're a mixture of clay and silt and organic material. And all of those have different densities, right? So they're a big mixture of mud. In terms of spatial distributions, our expectation was that we would have the largest flocs up in the top of the water column and the smallest flocs at the bed where the shear is highest. And we figured it would break the flocs apart. And we saw that in one location, but that was the only location that we saw that. For the most part, it seemed like flocs are kind of the same size in the water column everywhere that we looked. And there wasn't a lot of difference from across the channel either. So if we went, from one bank to the next. So one of the takeaways for us is that we think if we're going to model mud transport in a river on a larger scale, we think using cross-sectionally averaged values for floc size is reasonable based on our data here. You don't necessarily need to resolve all of the vertical variation. The other thing, here's some other plots of sort of average size. One thing that we saw is that as we do see that more energetic systems far upstream have smaller flocs, and then as you move downstream and there's less energy, the flocs get bigger. So G is something we use in the flocculation world. It's a turbulent shear rate. It's related to the dissipation rate of turbulent kinetic energy. So just think of this as some measure of how turbulent it is. Okay, so it's also related to estimates of the Kolmogorov microlength scale. So floc sizes, they tend to scale with the Kolmogorov microlength scale as long as you can keep material in suspension. So if you can keep material in suspension, they will get to be about as big as the Kolmogorov microlength scale. Above that, the shear that an individual floc experiences increases and it starts to break down at a faster rate. But there's also, if you keep reducing the amount of turbulence, you start to get settling. So you settle out your mud flocs. And so what happens is that there's a region here where you start to lose material from suspension down to the bed. You can only keep smaller flocs in suspension. So what you will end up seeing is that there's some kind of optimum turbulence level in terms of being able to keep the biggest flocs in suspension. So we did see as you move downstream, we get smaller or bigger flocs as the turbulence decreases. But the larger effect was that there was this rather substantial difference to us that we found with this data between summer and winter. We really struggled as to none of the data that we measured explained that, because there was no difference in the salts, there was no difference in the dissolved organic content. The only thing that was different was the difference in temperature. So we initially thought, well, maybe the difference in temperature is changing the viscosity, and that's changing the size of the eddies between the winter and the summer. But it should make the smallest eddies bigger in the winter and smaller in the summer. And that should make the winter flocs bigger and the summer flocs smaller. So we don't think that's what's going on. So our hypothesis here is that it has to do with microbial activity, that the warmer water and the increased light during the summer months lead to more microbial activity and the production of extracellular polymeric substances, which help to glue these flocs together. So we think, the data that we collected, it's correlated with temperature, but our expectation is that that has to do with microbial activity. And we're doing extra work to try to, in hopes of understanding if that's the case or not. Another thing we wanted to test with this was there's been data that's been collected from point samples of suspended sediment in the water column. And you get a water column sample and you break that water column sample into muds and sands, right? And sands will have this very nice Rousean profile, vertical profile, where the settling velocity of the sand, which is tied to the size, will really dictate the distribution of that, the concentration distribution of that size fraction over the depth. And there have been some data some studies looking at the vertical concentration distribution for the mud fraction, right? So you split it into sand and mud. And if you just look at the mud and group it all together as everything less than 63 microns, you can find, if you run a calculation on the disaggregated mud size, your Rouse number that you would get should say that the mud is vertically well mixed. There's not much of a vertical concentration gradient, but there have been observations of vertical concentration gradients. And so one of the things that we wanted to look at was, could the floc size, like floc sizes as they get bigger, the settling velocity gets bigger. So the reason we might get a vertical concentration gradient for the mud might be that there's flocs that were present. And so the fact that we get a vertical concentration profile for the mud might be indicative of flocculation. And the stronger that gradient, the stronger, the bigger the flocs, the less that gradient, the less the flocs. And so what we did was we measured floc sizes and estimated settling velocity from floc settling velocity equations. And then we just fit Rouse profiles to the mud and backed out what the settling velocity would need to be in order to match that measured profile. And we compared the two. And it turned out that in many cases, you could attribute the vertical concentration gradient of mud directly to floc sizes. So bigger flocs, more gradient, and the values that we backed out from the Rouse profile matched really well the values that we estimated by measuring the floc sizes and estimating a floc density and calculating the settling velocity that way. But that wasn't always the case. So there's some cases where like the measured settling or the settling velocity extracted from a Rouse profile is like on the order of like 2 millimeters per second, which is much bigger than any settling velocity you could get for just mud flocs. So we think there are two reasons for this. One might be that there is a higher silt content in these flocs that are increasing the density, causing them to settle faster. And the other one might be from a case of an actively eroding mud bed where you don't have a balance between erosion and deposition, which is pretty fundamental to the, or entrainment and deposition, which is fundamental to the Rouse profile solution. So we think in some cases, flocs are explaining vertical distributions, vertical gradients and concentration of mud, but in other cases, they're not. Okay, let me, I'm going to bypass this and move on to this next study. So this is the mud exchange with gravel beds. Okay, so now we're going to move farther upstream in the river, and we're going to look at two questions. One is, can mud settle to a gravel bed? And if so, what dictates how much mud settles? And the other question is, can we extract mud from a gravel bed without mobilizing the gravel? Okay, so let's go right here. Okay, so let's go back. We're going to be back to this setting here of gravel bed river. This has really big particles. We're going to look at things in the lab and things in a small, a creek that has small gravel. But right, transport methods for predicting the movement of sediment downstream, they're largely developed for gravel or for sand, maybe some combination of gravel and sand. but it's usually for this non-cohesive material, and we think of that as the bed material load. And then the really fine fraction, oftentimes we just treat as a wash load that moves through the system. And we know it's there, but we don't worry too much about trying to make calculations with it. And so this is the fraction that we're going to focus on, is like, how does this fraction interact with this? And I don't think it should be like I'm okay with part of the idea of the wash load from a practical standpoint, morphologically, but this fine fraction does interact with the bed, and maybe what would be nice is if we could predict how it moves through the system. Okay, so this is just some examples of mud. We call it wash load in it morphologically in a gravel bed river, but we have fine material all over the place in our gravel bed rivers, right? So these are just examples from different papers that I pulled where, even if you run experiments with gravel, you put this nice gravel in your flume, you turn it on, all of a sudden your flume is muddy because it had little small particles on that. And that happens in rivers and in flumes. Like, here's a case of looking at the percentage of area covered by fine sediment in a gravel bed stream. Here's some other, this is in a Badlands area in Spain, but there's a ton of fine sediment intermixed with all of this gravel. And so mud, these are just cases where we know that mud is being captured, stored, and released from gravel beds. And we just want to understand some more about this process. So this, based on observing this tailing ponds, a catastrophe that happened where you could see the tailings in the river, we thought, let's run an experiment where we have a clay suspension in a flume. And then we're going to look at 3 types of beds. We're going to run just our clay suspension over a plain acrylic flume bed. And then we're going to run it on a pure gravel bed, like an open framework gravel bed. And then we're going to run it with a gravel sand mixture. So we've got gravel and sand all mixed in here. And we're just going to run the flume for a long period of time. I don't know, here we have 1,400 minutes here. And we're going to measure the concentration of the clay up in the water column. And we're going to do it for 2 phases. One where we just run it at a constant discharge, a constant shear rate. And we're going to treat that as the deposition phase. And that's everything to the left of this dashed line. And then after that, we're going to keep stepping up the discharge and see if we can re-entrain that deposited material. So there are 3 lines. This is a decay in concentration. The farther down this line goes, that means that we're depositing more material, or we're losing more material from the water column to the bed, right? And so for the acrylic, we don't lose as much. For the gravel, we lose the most. And for the sand gravel, we lose somewhere in between. Okay, so that's the interesting thing here. So, let me also mention here that if we just calculated a Rouse number based on our clay size and the shear velocity, we would get something of 0.01. So you might look at that and say, hey, all the materials should be suspended, should be flushing through the system, but it's all interacting with the bed. Not all of it just deposits, but some of it's going to deposit. So for the acrylic, we could always re-entrain it when we started to ramp back up the flow. But for both the sand gravel mix and the gravel, we can never re-entrain the material. Once it got to the bed, it was lost to the bed. We never ran, and our stresses were never high enough to mobilize this. Okay, so 2 takeaways here, one, well, maybe 3. One, we were having fine sediment depositing to the bed, even for really small Rouse numbers. So if you looked at some kind of suspension threshold, everything should be well suspended. And yeah, that's how the material travels in suspension, but some of it gets to the bed. And the thing is, there's all this, right? There's some overall resistance that's reflective of the system as a whole that we get a shear velocity from. But locally around these gravel particles and in the pore space, there's very little velocity. There's very little turbulent stress. And so if particles can get there through settling or turbulent diffusion, they get trapped. They get trapped. Sometimes they just stick to the cohesive particles will stick to the rocks, but other times, and where most of it is, what's mostly happening is getting just trapped in the dead pore zone, or the dead space in the pores, the dead water in the pores. And so it turned out that the parameter that best described the capture rate of sediment was a pore Reynolds number. So more pore space, we capture more mud. Less pore space, we capture less mud. And then once it was lost here, we could not get it back out unless we remobilized the bed. Okay, so our thought had been like, yeah, the more pore space you have, so a nice clean gravel bed river is primed to soak up a ton of fine sediment. Maybe you get to a point where you build up enough fine sediment in there that it no longer soaks up more fine sediment. But if you have a nice, like open framework gravel, a bunch of pore space, that thing can soak up, doesn't matter how small the particle size is, it's going to get caught in that bed. And the bigger the pore space, the more is going to get caught. Okay, so we thought like you're going to have to entrain this, you're going to have to entrain the gravel to mobilize everything. But then we also thought like maybe as you get more fine sediment, your ability to capture the fine sediment is going to go down. Okay, so this is a quick, we'll talk through this field work here. Like the lab work that we'd done said like we're going to have to mobilize the gravel to release the sediment, but there are patches in these little creeks around Blacksburg that if you just walk around in them, you get all of these plumes of fine sediment billowing up. And you see changes in the amount of fine sediment in the bed as different times of the year will clean out. Then there's a bunch of mud, cleans out. And so we are interested in that process of buildup and release of mud in these fine gravel bed rivers. And our idea would be that like this level of the presence of fine sediment, or we're going to call it embeddedness here, has something to do with the transport characteristics. And then the other thing that we noticed was that a lot of the material in this upper layer seemed to us to be behaving cohesionlessly. We have these really, like there are flocs, like we put our floc camera in there, all this mud is very strongly flocculated, but the cohesive forces work to create a floc, but then this floc acts as a low density cohesionless grain interacting with other low density cohesionless grains. And we're not building up enough mud to cause like dewatering and consolidation and for those to bind together into really solid mud bed. Instead, what we have is this rather loose, fluffy layer. And so one of our ideas was, I wonder if kind of standard sand entrainment equations could predict the erosion rate of mud from this bed. Okay, so those are some of our questions. I guess I already asked those. So we're after this. Let me also define one thing here. We're going to talk about the embeddedness of the particle. And we're going to use this definition of embeddedness as we have a particle diameter here, d, and then the distance from the top of the mud layer here, or the fines, to the bottom is some z. And this ratio is something we're going to call embeddedness. So embeddedness ranges from 0 to 1. And so one of our questions was, can we just pull the mud up without eroding the gravel? And if so, is it a function of where this mud sits in this? Because we were running experiments where there's no embeddedness and we couldn't extract anything. But if the mud is really close to the surface, it's exposed and the flow has access to it, and we expect that it's going to be easier to entrain. Okay, so we ran experiments in some local creeks. What we did was we built a little channel here out of, this is just gutter material from the hardware store. We cut a hole in it. So we've got this, it's a square duct here, and the hole cut in it. And then we pump river water through this apparatus that we affectionately call the benthic cannon, and we blast mud out of here. And so we can control the flow rate moving through the channel. And then on the other end here, we measure with a turbidity sensor, we measure the turbidity. From that, we can get a mass flow rate. We also and from the turbidity, which we map over to a concentration of sediment, and then we also measure the velocity coming out here. And so then we get a mass flow rate, and then we integrate that over time, and essentially we get the mass that we eroded. So we get the eroded mass for a given shear coming out of here, and then we put our camera in here, and we also measure the particles that are coming out of the cannon to see what those particles are like. Okay, we ran experiments in creeks around Blacksburg. So here are the Appalachian Mountains right in here. And we sit right on the Eastern Continental Divide. So part of the town, the water flows to the Gulf of Mexico. The other part is going to flow to the Atlantic. Something to note is the gravel bed streams around here. They are predominantly gravel, but they're quite fine. So the D50 is going to be like 5 to 25 millimeters. Part of that has to do with these local sites. Part of that has to do with the nature of we couldn't get a good seal between the cannon and the bed when we have really big particles. So, because we don't want the material blowing out the sides, we want it to come out the end of the cannon so we can make our measurements. So we are only looking at relatively fine gravels, partly because of where these measurements are made, and partly because of the design of the apparatus. Okay, so results. Can mud be moved before the gravel is mobilized? Yes, at all of these sites we can move it. Second question was the critical condition dependent on the embeddedness? And the answer was yes. So here's a plot we have. This is the shear velocity when we first start to see erosion of material from the cannon, scaled by the settling velocity of those mud flocks versus the embeddedness. So as the embeddedness goes up, or as that mud layer or the fines layer gets closer to the surface, this critical value goes down, right? So it's easier to move material when the mud is really up, is close up to the surface, right? That makes sense, but that was the case. And then the second question was, could we model the entrainment of the mud with the classic sand bed entrainment equation? So we looked at a bunch of classic sand bed entrainment equations. And for those of you who know this, right, we're looking at this E sub S, which is in a system where we have a balance between erosion and deposition, which we don't have here. This is also equivalent to the near bed concentration, but we're using it as an entrainment velocity or an entrainment rate here. Okay, so we plotted for all different types. We're just going to look at the Garcia and Parker because that one did the best for our data. So what we found here is that given this is like, think of this as the applied stress given the weight of the particle, some kind of Rouse type parameter here. That equation over predicted the amount of material that was removed, right? So it didn't really work. But what we did find is if we just added a type of hiding function where we added the ratio of the size of the material being eroded to the size of the gravel, the D50 of the gravel in the bed, make this a power function because it's always good to make things a power function. You'll make it work if you make it a power function. This data kind of pulled back and got in, so we were able to with this framework for entrainment rate that's based on cohesionless sand data, if we modified it based on the size of the flocculated material and the size of the bed sediment, we were able to have this data shift over. Now, this is only for the streams in our area, and there's I don't know if this holds more broadly, but for our case, it did hold. And then the other thing we wanted to know was, at least for this site, we like how small of a window is this flow condition where we can erode the mud and but not move the gravel. And for us, it's this green band here. So this is a stage relationship here for this one particular creek in here. And when you get up to stages about 1 meter to 1.5 meters, you're mobilizing most of the gravel. And then this is the band down here where we expect mobilization of the mud given some reasonable embeddedness level. So we did find that what can happen is that there can be this decoupling in the downstream transport between the mud and the gravel. They don't all get released at the same time. So the mud can be released while the gravel is stable, or they can go at the same time. But I think a big, let me just, there's some, this is probably the big thing here. We'll talk about this and then we're going to stop. Thing that we took away from this study was that, right, a mud, it exists in this aggregate form. It can deposit to a gravel bed, and it can be reentrained from a gravel bed. It's for us, we don't think it should be thought of so much as a wash load. So instead, like a hop load, it's just making big hops, but it can get captured in the bed, it can get released. And so the time scale of movement downstream isn't just going with the flow. Like you can't just take the flow velocity and then say, well, that's like treat the sediment, the mud as some kind of like a passive scalar or something. It does settle. And if there's pore space available in the gravel, it will eat up more of the mud than if there isn't that pore space. And then the mud coming back out of that is going to depend on how much mud there is there. If the mud is pretty high, if it's that fines are packed up close to the top of the gravel, then you can release bits of that mud at much lower flow rates than is needed to mobilize the gravel as a whole. Obviously, if you mobilize the gravel, then you mobilize a whole ton of fine sediment as well. But we like this idea of a hop load, that the mud moving through gravel bed reach should be thought of as a hop load instead of a wash load. All right, I'm going to stop there, and hopefully there's time for questions. Is that okay? Yeah. Does that work good? Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
I think we have time for a couple questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, great seminar. Thank you. I was wondering if there's any crossover between literature for water treatment, drinking water treatment, flocculation.
Yeah.
You're doing.
There's a lot of crossover. And in fact, when I got into this because someone asked me about if the mud was flocculating in the Houston ship channel. And I said, I didn't know. And I started just reading literature, and a lot of the initial work or some of the methods that we're using come from drinking and wastewater treatment. The big difference there is that they're always adding a coagulant. And so some of the theory around how you map like the density of this particle to the size comes from drinking water and wastewater treatment. And some of the initial ideas about like there needing to be salt for this to flocculate comes from that as well. Seeing floc as that destabilizing agent that allows the particles to get close enough to flocculate. So we look at that, but it doesn't explain like all of the things that we see in the natural with the natural flux. But yeah, there's a ton of really good information there, and some of the fundamental ideas mathematically about how to treat these come from the drinking and wastewater treatment literature.
We had a water treatment specialist here named Dave Hendricks. He was on the environmental faculty.
Yeah.
His last piece of work was a big book on water treatment, and there's a chapter I feel pretty sure on this.
Oh yeah, I'm sure yeah, I'm sure there is, and it'd be so. I haven't done much reading from that literature over the last few years, but I read a lot of it So Logan, Bruce Logan, was an environmental engineer who did some of the had a lot of work on flocculation associated with drinking water and wastewater. Yeah, there's a lot of good information there. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thanks for this very interesting talk. I have a couple of questions. The first one is that when you're showing the Gaussian distribution
Yeah.
for your first part of research. and,
Yeah.
I think you already explained why it looks like that, but I probably missed the point. Yeah, this one. So if I remember correctly, what you get from the field is that in the summer, you got a larger particle
Yeah.
size for
Yeah.
the population.
Yep.
So this Gaussian distribution is actually opposite to what I expect to see, because if the population is
Yeah.
higher, that means that you
Yep.
have higher settlement velocity.
Yes.
So usually we will have like more gradient.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a very good point. So you've got, so we have one profile here that I didn't talk about. This is in Southwest Pass, but if we just look at the Bonnie Carey and the Venice, and really the place where you can compare it is between the Venice main channel in summer, which had bigger flocks, and the Venice main channel in winter, which had smaller flocks. Yeah, so you would expect that these shapes would be reversed.
Yes.
Yeah, right. So here, if I just fit a Rouse profile for the summer to the concentration data, I get a settling velocity of about 0.5 millimeter per second, which is really close to what I estimate from measuring the flock sizes and using some of the theory from Bruce Logan about settling velocity of these. They match really well. So in this case, I feel comfortable saying any kind of like stratification, it seems to be coming from the flocks. So this was the part that doesn't fit that theory. Like the settling velocity here is really high. There's no way this settling velocity from this fit is coming from the measured flock sizes. So I think there are two reasons for that. One of them I think has to do with there's a chance that the flocks are smaller, but they have these silt particles that are bound up in them still. And so their scaling between size and density is not quite the same as the summer. So they're denser than we would expect because a larger fraction of that volume is made up with a solid silt particle, which is increasing the density. That's part of it. But I think the bigger, I think the bigger reason is that before we went out on this cruise for the winter, it had been a low flow and the salt wedge had progressed almost up to New Orleans. Once the salt wedge is in place in the Mississippi River, it becomes a big mud collector. So the mud just accretes on the bed, enough to like wipe out the dune fields. It's just blankets of mud. Then when the flow gets higher, it entrains the salt water, pushes out that wedge. And so we're in a condition here when we were there where the flow is high enough and it fully pushed out the salt wedge. We drop our CTD through the water column. It's fresh. There's no difference in the conductivity between summer and winter. But now we have, before here, if I sampled the bed, it would be sandy. If I sampled the bed here, it's just big, gloppy, unconsolidated mud. And so I think what happens, like the Rouse theory is based on an equilibrium between your downward settling flux and the upward. And I think upward here is outpacing downward because we have an actively eroding mud bed. So it's just, we have more eroding than is depositing, which I believe should lead to something that looks like a profile that has higher concentrations near the bed. I don't know. Maybe my theory part on that is off a little bit. I'm not sure, but that's my explanation. So that's where I was saying, yeah, if we get vertical concentration gradients in the mud, sometimes it seems to be explained by the flock sizes, but not always. So this one here, yeah, it's not. It's something else is going on. And I think that is important for interpreting these vertical mud profile data.
And a follow-up question will be, if we can see the gradient of that Gaussian distribution,
Yeah.
that means that we'll have higher concentration near the bed.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if the stratification effect will play a
Yeah,
role
yeah.
and kind of make this gradient even sharper.
Yeah, in general, stratification makes the gradient sharper. So in this analysis, we tried to also account for that, for the stratification. Yeah. Mhm.
I think that puts us at time, but if you want to stick around for more questions, feel free. But yeah, thanks for coming, everybody.